Welcome to your second video in our Chapter 22 video lecture series, where we are going to do an overview of the immune system. First, we'll start with our immune cells and their locations. We have our leukocytes within our blood, and these are our white blood cells. They're first going to be formed in the red bone marrow, and we classify them into different groups. We have our granulocytes, which consist of our neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And the other group is called our agranulocytes, which consists of our monocytes and lymphocytes. Now, these two groups are separated because our granulocytes have granules that we can see through staining, and they're larger granules. So our neutrophil is almost of like a clear color, hence the word neutro. We have our eosinophils, in which their granules stain red. Eosin means red. And basophils, you can think of that B for blue because their large granules stain blue. Whereas our agranulocytes have extremely small granules, so we can't really see them. Our monocytes are going to be called that as they flow through our blood, but once they leave the bloodstream, we're going to change their name to macrophages, and they enter the tissues in search of pathogens or abnormal cells or debris to gobble up. Our lymphocytes are going to have small granules as well, and we know them as our B and T lymphocytes, or B and T cells. They also are going to be our NK, or natural killer cells. So we'll talk more about these cells once we get into our different immune systems. So next, let's talk about where we're going to find these immune cells. Most leukocytes are found in our body tissues instead of our blood. So we just got through Chapter 21, which discussed our lymphatic system. And so we'll find these immune cells within our secondary lymphoid structures. That would include our B and T cells, our macrophages, dendritic cells, which I mentioned in that last chapter that these are antigen-presenting cells along with our macrophages, and our NK cells. We're going to find all of those in the lymph nodes, the spleen, tonsils, MALT, which stood for our mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, and lymphoid nodules that we can find throughout the body. We also have select organs that house macrophages. So we have some macrophages that will travel throughout the body. They're known more as transient macrophages, whereas the ones that stay within specific organs are called resident macrophages, and will sometimes have specific names for them. For example, we have the ones in the lungs known as alveolar macrophages, or my favorite name for them, sometimes they are called dust cells. And I said as these macrophages, the ones that are able to move around the body, are called transient macrophages. They're also called migrating macrophages. We also have specific immune cells that will stay within our skin or mucosal membranes. So they tend to house our dendritic cells, and they are derived from those monocytes that we talked about, the ones that change their name to macrophages once they leave the bloodstream. And their job is to engulf pathogens and migrate into lymph so that we can hopefully catch the pathogens within our lymphoid structures, such as the lymph node. Our connective tissues are going to house our mast cells. Mast cells typically in close proximity to our small blood vessels, so that when we release the histamine, it creates an effect pretty quickly. They are abundant within our dermis, that deeper layer of our skin, and the mucosa of our respiratory, gastrointestinal, and urogenital tracts. We also find them in our connective tissues of our organs, which would include the endomysium of our muscle. Now let's talk about our cytokines. These are small proteins that are going to regulate immune activity. They're produced by cells of both our innate and adaptive immune systems. We haven't really discussed the difference between those two immune systems, but just in a nutshell, our innate is pretty much what we're born with and what we have. So even our physical defenses, such as having our skin intact, is in our innate immune system. Whereas adaptive, we tailor make an immune defense to the specific pathogen that enters our body. So we find the cytokines in both of them, and they serve as chemical messengers that are released from one cell that bind to receptors of our target cell, so we can have certain actions take place. When it acts on a cell that released that chemical first to begin with, so let's say I have cell A releases a cytokine, it acts on cell A, that is called an autocrine signaling. If it is going to work on local cells, so I have cell A secreting a cytokine, but it goes to cell B and C nearby, that is called paracrine signaling. Para meaning close by, surrounding. Or if I have cell A secrete a cytokine and it goes to cell Z, then it's traveling far away to these distant cells after circulating through the blood, and that would be more of endocrine signaling. And these cytokines have a short half-life, so they don't last very long. The effects could be signaling certain cells to have a specific response, and this includes non-immune cells, for example, our neurons, to maybe release a certain neurotransmitter. It could control development and behavior of our immune cells. It can regulate inflammatory responses and destroy specific cells. All right, so here's where we get into comparing innate and adaptive immunity. And the reason that these immune systems were separated is because they, well, not always, but have majority of their cells different as far as where they're involved in the immune response. They have specificity of a cell response or lack of. They have certain mechanisms of eliminating harmful substances that are differing, and the amount of time for the response to take place. For instance, our innate immune response will be much faster and immediate versus our adaptive immunity. But they are both going to work together in order to defend the body. So let's start off with our innate immunity. This is present at birth. It's going to protect us against a variety of substances, and so we call it non-specific. It does not care what type of pathogen it comes into contact with, whether it's a virus, a protozoan, a parasitic worm, it's going to treat it the same. And we don't necessarily have to have any prior exposure in order to have this response. It's going to do the same thing no matter what. And so it's going to include barriers of our skin and mucosal membranes. Remember, those membranes are going to line the GI tract, respiratory tract, and our urogenital tract, and non-specific cellular and molecular internal defenses. We'll get into those details in the next section. And like I said, it's a quick response. It's immediate to harmful agents. Then we have our adaptive immunity, which is also known as our acquired or specific immunity. And this is the one that I said has a tailored response to a pathogen. So we have that response to what we call an antigen. An antigen is going to be a protein particle that we're typically going to pick up and see as foreign using our immune cells. And it's going to involve triggering specific B and T lymphocytes. A particular cell is going to respond to one specific foreign substance, but not another. And it takes several days to develop this in order for it to be effective. And I really like this figure here because it really does a good job outlining an overview of each of these systems. So looking over at our innate immunity, like we said, we have multiple components that are going to protect against a wide array of substances. We have some physical defenses like our skin and mucosal membranes that help prevent entry of that pathogen into our body, and then our non-specific internal defenses that can include most of our immune cells like macrophages and NK cells, chemicals, including interferons and complement proteins, which we'll get into in the next section, and then physiological responses, which include inflammation and fever. With our adaptive immunity, it's going to be provided by those lymphocytes, or B and T cells, that become activated, and they're going to clone themselves or replicate themselves, and they'll be specific and tailored to the antigen that was found within our body. And so these lymphocytes are going to act in different ways. Our T cells are known as our cell-mediated immunity, and we'll talk about the specific mechanisms that they go through in, I believe, section 4. And then our B cells are known as our antibody-mediated immunity, and that tells us that we're going to need to produce some antibodies, right? So the B cells are going to differentiate into plasma cells, and they will synthesize and release the antibodies, again, that are tailored to the specific antigen of that pathogen.